students, today we are going to move on to our activity to observe and evaluate the parts and functions of cells. So for finding out of cells, definitely there are many different types of cells with many different parts and functions. So what we're going to do is that we're going to look at some specimens, real life specimens of plants and animal cells using our trusty microscope and some prepared slides. So I'm going to give you instructions on how to look at it, but basically what I will let you see is actually what I see through my eyepiece over here. Okay, so let's start. Okay students, so now next step we're going to put in the onion epidermis onto the stage to see the cells of the onion. So what we're going to do is that we are going to set the slide in, make sure that your microscope is turned on and you are at the lowest magnification first. Usually we start with the lowest magnification before we move on to the higher ones. Okay, so the first thing is once you put your slide under the microscope, usually you likely to get a blur image. So you need to adjust the big focus knob to get the image into view first. The viewing may still be a bit blur, so you just use the fine focus knob to give a more focused image, to get a more focused image. That's when you can observe that the cells of the onion is definitely a plant cell, because you can see the regular shape and you can even see some of the nucleus of the onion cell here. Now you may not be able to see the chloroplast or even some of the other parts of the cell yet, because you will actually need to zoom in to a more powerful magnification in order to see that. Okay, but here today's activity we are just looking at this in terms of how does a plant cell look like. Okay, right now let's move on to the next slide. This is an animal cell. I'm not going to tell you what the animal cell is first. Let's have a look. Okay, so again it's blur, or if it's out of position, then you have to adjust your microscope accordingly. Then now I'm going to focus in on this cell. Oops. Okay, so you can see that this cell is actually quite big. And if I were to look at it, okay, so that means shift its position, you can see that it is actually a round thing. Okay, do you want to make a guess what is this? Okay, now the next slide we're going to look at is another slide from a plant part. So over here, let me do the adjustment. Okay, so I did the coarse focus knob adjustment. Now I'm going to use the fine focus knob just to get the image a bit clearer. Now, what you see here is actually part of the sponge grout stem. So it's actually the stem from a plant. And for those of you who have already learned about plant transport system, that means the water carrying tubes and the food carrying tubes, you can see that the big circles over here in the cell structures itself is actually those of the plant transport tubes. Okay, those are actually the plant transport tubes, because it's a cross section of the stem of the sponge grout cell. Okay, so you can see that it's a plant cell because all the cells actually have a regular shape that enables them to interlock with each other to form a structure, okay, that is able to give rise to the water carrying tubes and the food carrying tubes. Next cell over here, you can see that it is all quite brown, and even as I focus, it isn't really very clear if you have to think between an animal cell and plant cell. But if you look closely at the fine structures in the view over here, you can actually find some connecting parts, connecting the cells together. Okay, and those are actually the cell walls. So with that, definitely you know this is a plant cell. And do you know which plant this comes from? This comes from your celery leaf. The next thing we are going to see over here is actually an animal part that comes from a canary, and that is actually the feather. You can see that when we look at the microscope, the canary's feathers has many small fine hairs in the feather that actually makes it what it is. Okay, so just focus again to help you to see the parts. Okay. The next part of an insect that we're going to see here is actually a dragonfly's wing. So for a dragonfly's wing, you are actually able to see that there are many parts that is clear, and there's also many parts that are jointed. Okay, and if you zoom in, you can actually see the spikes or the hard outer body covering of hairs even on the wings itself. So insects usually they have very fine stiff hairs on their legs in order to help them to cling on to walls and even walk on walls very easily without falling off. Okay, so you can see that the wing itself mostly is clear except for the joining part. So this is how a dragonfly's wing looks like under the microscope.